Welcome to the sixth meeting of the Standing Committee on Official Languages. It's Wednesday, November 27th, 2013. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 and the motion adopted on Monday, November 18th, 2013.
Report for 2012-2013 of the Commissioner of Official Languages referred to the committee on Thursday, November 7th, 2013. And we have in front of us this afternoon Madame Tremblay, Monsieur Giguère, Madame Seckley, and most importantly, the Commissioner himself, Mr. Fraser. You may begin with an opening statement, Mr. Fraser.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Bonjour. I'm particularly pleased to be here before you today to share a few of my thoughts on my 2012-2013 annual report, which I tabled in Parliament on November the 7th. But first, I'd like to recognize the recently re-elected chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Languages, the Honourable Michael Chong. Mr. Chair, I'm confident that your knowledge of our official languages and your invaluable leadership on key issues such as bilingual education will serve the committee well in its deliberations during this current session of Parliament. En février dernier, le Premier ministre Stephen Harper
This past February, Prime Minister Stephen Harper asked me to stay on as Commissioner of Official Languages for an additional 3 years, and I was honored to accept. Over the course of my first mandate as Commissioner, one of the questions that I've often received is the most general and yet the most difficult one. How are we doing in terms of official bilingualism? The answer is often unsatisfying. It depends. My 7th and latest annual report will attempt to explain that answer in some detail. The report was conceived as a summary of my 7 years as Commissioner of Official Languages. Even though my mandate has been extended for another 3 years, I feel that this has been a useful exercise to examine the progress, or lack thereof, made during these past 7 years.
Back on the successful outcomes that have resulted from our investigations and proactive interventions. 7 years ago, my investigation into complaints by official language minority communities following the abolition of the Court Challenges Program of Canada and my subsequent seeking of intervenor status before the Federal Court showed the government had not respected its obligations under Part 7 of the Official Languages Act. Mobilization by these committees resulted in an out-of-court settlement that established the Language Rights Support Program. Last year, my investigation into the appointment of a unilingual Auditor General added credence to a private member's bill that was passed unanimously by Parliament and now requires all agents of Parliament to be bilingual at the moment of their appointment. In addition, my office's collaborative work with federal institutions and the organizing committee of the Vancouver 2010 Olympic Winter Games led to a very successful event presented in both official languages, with the unfortunate exception of the cultural component of the opening ceremonies. The invaluable lessons learned from this experience resulted in the production of a practical guide to promoting official languages for any organization hosting a major sporting event in Canada. This past summer, Canada Games organizers in Sherbrooke used the guide and were clearly successful in promoting both official languages during this national event, proof that we've made great strides. Je peux également mentionner notre enquête sur la décision de déplacer le centre secondaire.
I can also point to our investigation into the decision to move the Quebec City Marine Rescue Subcenter to Trenton and Halifax, which led to the postponement of the move until emergency services on the St. Lawrence could be guaranteed in French. As well, when CBC Radio-Canada decided to eliminate virtually all local programming at French-language radio station CBEF in Windsor, generated 876 complaints in 2009-2010, I asked the federal court whether I have the jurisdiction to investigate such complaints. This was confirmed by the court in a preliminary decision. There have also been a few outcomes during my tenure that I would characterize as conspicuous failures. For example, the government failed to see the importance of having bilingual Supreme Court judges. I've given my support to Bill C-232, which sought to amend the Supreme Court of Canada Act. This is because I firmly believe that any litigant appearing before the Supreme Court should have the right to be heard and understood by all the judges in either official language without the aid of an interpreter. This year, my office completed a study on the bilingual capacity of the Superior Court judiciary, which I presented at the Canadian Bar Association's legal conference this past August. This marked the first time I worked on a joint project with my provincial counterparts in New Brunswick and Ontario. The impact of this study and its recommendations are crucial for Canadians who will use the court system. This is why we are urging the Minister of Justice to act quickly on the recommendations in the study, in close collaboration with his provincial and territorial counterparts, as well as with the Chief Justices of the Superior Courts.
There were some pleasant surprises. I found that there's much less resistance to the Official Languages Act inside federal institutions than I'd expected. But from time to time, there are incidents that indicate that officials simply don't understand what it means to have two official languages with equal status. Last month, there was an incident here on the Hill that I must admit I found completely unacceptable. A briefing for parliamentarians on Bill C-4, the Omnibus Bill, was made available only in English. An MP complained, officials objected, and another MP complained he didn't understand the conversation. The briefing was delayed for a day. Frankly, I thought that unilingual briefings had gone the way of typewriters. and that French to follow was a thing of the past. I thought that Parliament's unanimous decision to ensure that agents of Parliament were bilingual was recognition that Canadians, not to mention parliamentarians, have an absolute right to equal quality of service in the official language of their choice. The fact that a member of Parliament even had to ask for a briefing in French in 2013, 55 years after simultaneous interpretation was introduced into the House of Commons, and 50 years after the launch of the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, is deeply disappointing. Despite these embarrassing lapses, most federal institutions and most public servants want to do the right thing. Sometimes they simply have trouble getting the tools they need and developing the reflexes to use them. To do our part, my office developed online tools for federal institutions and employees, including a self-assessment tool for managers to evaluate whether their behavior supports the use of both languages in the workplace, and more recently, a tool to develop effective language training practices. There have also been some disappointments. The complaints I've received, coupled with the findings of our various studies and audits, tell me that much remains to be done in order to meet the obligations and the spirit of the Act fully. When federal employees provide services to Canadians, active offer is still the exception, not the rule. It also remains difficult for air travelers to be served in the official language of their choice in Canadian airports. Too often, people have to ask. And too often, when they do, they face incomprehension or delays. In the public sector, it's quite common for leaders to say a few words in French and then continue uninterrupted in English, as if the use of French at a public event were merely a symbolic gesture rather than the natural expression of a Canadian language. Even here in Ottawa, I get the feeling that speakers, even if they're bilingual, are hesitant to speak French in public. As well, federal institutions have been uncertain about how to take positive measures for the growth and development of official language minority communities as required by the 2005 amendment of the Official Languages Act. Il y a 5 ans, le gouvernement a publié sa feuille de route pour la dualité linguistique qui
5 years ago, the government issued its roadmap for linguistic duality, which expired this year, and was replaced with the roadmap for Canada's official languages, which runs through to 2018. During this time, we've experienced a period of financial instability, heavy federal investment in infrastructure projects, the Strategic and Operating Review, and the Deficit Reduction Action Plan. Generally speaking, official languages have not been targeted, but there has been collateral damage and unintended consequences for official languages stemming from closures and cutbacks. The result has been a subtle erosion of bilingualism through the transfer of federal offices from bilingual to unilingual regions, the reduction of language skill levels required for bilingual positions, the pressure on public servants to produce documents in English only, and the regular failure to offer a sufficient number of training programs in French. We also see the posting of senior management positions where both official languages are described as an asset rather than a requirement, or described as a requirement and then not considered as such. The consequence of all this is a quiet undermining of the use of both languages in the workplace and of the ability to offer services in English and in French. My work over the past 7 years has shown me how much leadership matters in federal institutions. As Commissioner, I will continue to stress the importance of second language learning, whether in our universities or in the public service. As well, I will continue to position the use of both official languages as a key leadership competency. What lies ahead in the field of official languages? What challenges will need to be addressed over the next 3 years of my mandate? Immigration and the demographic change it brings are critical issues for minority language communities and for the country as a whole. Social media will continue to transform the way that government deals with citizens. Essentially, the public's expectation for an immediate response in either official language is greater than ever. Social media represents both significant challenges and tremendous opportunities in terms of language policy. We know the Pan American Games will take place in Toronto in the summer of 2015. as well as a series of major anniversary events leading up to the 150th anniversary of Confederation in 2017. This is an opportunity for renewed engagement and leadership from the federal government. Throughout the planning stages and delivery of these events, it will be critical to respect the needs of both official language communities.
I've made recommendations in the following 6 areas: language training in federal institutions, the roadmap for Canada's official languages 2013-2018, specifically the need for a new management and accountability framework, immigration policies and their impact on Francophone minority communities, initiatives to raise the level of bilingualism among Canadians and reverse the decline in bilingualism among Anglophones, the bilingual capacity of our Superior Court judiciary, and the impact of budget cuts on federal institutions' abilities to respect their obligations. I believe we're now past the point where Canadians are shocked to hear the other language. This became quite evident to me this summer at the Canada Games in Sherbrooke. Both languages were used interchangeably during the opening ceremonies and elicited similar responses from those in attendance. Our official languages are a defining characteristic of our Canadian identity. We need to feel that both languages belong to us and are part of our sense of national identity, even if we don't speak one of them. One challenge that remains, I feel, is for all of us to embrace fully linguistic duality as a core Canadian value, no matter what language we speak. As the committee begins a new session, it will no doubt be considering where to focus its work. I've raised a number of issues, including those areas where I've made recommendations. I hope the committee finds this useful in determining which topics are deserving of its attention. On that note, Mr. Chair, I will conclude my remarks and be pleased to answer any questions you and your colleagues may have.
Merci, Monsieur Fraser.
Thank you, Commissioner Fraser. Before we move to a round of questions and answers, Mr. Godin will give us, as committee, a notice of 3 motions. Mr. Godin, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will give notice of motion. The first motion, that the committee invite the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans to give committee an update on the government's intentions concerning the Quebec City Marine Rescue Subcenter before Wednesday, December 11, 2013, and it's in both official languages. Second motion, that the Standing Committee on Official Languages invite the President and Director General of CBC Radio-Canada, Hubert Lacroix, to appear before the committee before mid-February 2014 in a televised meeting that will last 2 hours. And for the third motion, that the Standing Committee on Official Languages invite the Minister of Justice to appear before the committee to speak to the status of his department's strategy to implement the recommendations made by the Commissioner of Official Languages following his study on access to justice in both official languages before mid-February 2014. Thank you, Mr. Godin, for your notice of motions. Mr. Godin, you now have the floor to ask questions or make comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to welcome Commissioner Graham Fraser and his team to the committee. Let's get straight into the questions. Something that concerns me greatly, Mr. Commissioner, well, first of all, your report, I think, has noted quite clearly that things aren't going very well with this government. And everywhere in the country we see people in minority language communities who know that things aren't going well. But concerning the Quebec City Marine Rescue Subcenter, the government has not wanted to have the minister appear before this committee. You've done a report on this. You've made recommendations. I think that we've been dealing with this for 2 years now. You were to do some follow-up. The government passed you this hot potato and said that they would wait for your opinions. I wouldn't want to be in your position right now, given the way the government is handling this. But let's go back to your what are your first thoughts concerning this, and when will you make your conclusions public concerning follow-up on this issue? And, you know, this is 2 years we've been working on this, The government has not yet found competent people to work at Trenton in both official languages, and they haven't been able to find competent people to work in Halifax in both official languages. And I don't know, are you concerned about this? I'd be concerned in your position to say, oh, if I approve this, there will be 3 people who will be quitting their jobs at the same time, and somebody will be in trouble at the sea, and they'll get a response, sorry, I don't speak French. Will you feel responsible for that? We've already had problems with at Halifax with all the transfers from Moncton and all the government offices. Now, this is 2 years we've been looking at this. We haven't been able to replace people, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on all of this, Commissioner Fraser. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Concerning follow-up, our follow-up and our report of inquiry is underway at this time. What I've found interesting in the statement that would indicate that these changes would not be made before receiving the approval of the Commissioner. Well, listen, I don't give approval in that way. I don't give my approval for an action of the government. If the government establishes a structure, I come afterwards to see if things are working. So if they're waiting to make this move only after they've got my approval, well, they'll wait for a very, very long time, because that's not the way that my office works. It's as if we had said, for example, well, it would be like saying that they would need our approval before moving the Canadian Tourism Commission to Vancouver. Well, they didn't ask us, and if they had asked us, we would have said, no, things don't work that way. Do what you've decided to do. If you're determined to do this, if the government is determined to make a structural change to any institution, we'll look at what happens afterwards. If we receive complaints, we'll investigate those complaints. Mr. Chair, well, Commissioner, are you not concerned? This is 2 years that we've been dealing with this issue. Well, are you not concerned that there are people left who will say, I don't speak French, and somebody is going to get in trouble at sea? Well, the transfer hasn't taken place yet. The Maritime Centre in Quebec City continues to function, to the best of my knowledge, and I've been very clear that it's absolutely essential that maritime safety, the safety of ships and sailors, be assured at all times. That's a high bar to set, but that's a bar that has been necessarily set high to ensure the safety and security of all those who use the St. Lawrence River and the St. Lawrence Gulf. Yes, but through you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Fraser, the incidents that have happened in New Brunswick, the 3 people who lost their lives, 6 telephone calls were made to the Halifax Centre, and there was nobody there who spoke French. I'm sure you're aware of this. 6 calls before they were able to speak to someone in French. It doesn't work in Halifax, and it doesn't work in Trenton either. Another question that I have is the following. The question on changes the government has made to the way that it offers a service to the public. You've done a report, you've made recommendations, you asked for answers from the government before October 31st concerning Service Canada, which sent a third party to provide service, and the act is not being respected in BC. What will you do now that it's November 27th, I repeat, and the community, the language minority community in BC has brought the government before the courts in order to get language service rather in the language of their choice. Will you intervene in this case? Well, that's a decision that we're looking at. I don't think that we've made a decision on our intervention, but I'll ask Ms. Tremblay to answer your question. Well, we're doing a study of what's happened to our recommendations, and so once that study is done, we will decide whether or not to intervene in this court case. As it stands right now, the Commissioner's office is following up on the recommendations of the final report. Are there any recommendations that have been accepted? Has the government done anything? You gave the government just to until the 31st of October to answer these recommendations. Why are the people of BC obliged to go before the courts? Well, we are currently following up on this, and I won't be able to comment on that until our follow-up study is finished. And then we'll know what the government's response is to our recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Godin. Mr. Fraser. Mr. Gould.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank the witnesses for coming here today. And I'd also like to thank the Commissioner for visiting us in Quebec for the Vanier Cup. The commentator spoke in both official languages, English and French. Even the referees. Did you note this in your report? In Quebec City, it's a French-speaking city, but I think that they did make a significant effort so that everyone could take part and understand what was happening on this day. I did note that the presenting the awarding of the Vanier Cup was quite impressive in many respects. It wasn't exactly a snowstorm, but the weather was quite cold, and there was certainly cold winds blowing from Labrador. There was also the presentation and the fact that the Inter-University Sports Organization was very carefully presented in both languages. They did give me the opportunity to present the Commissioner's Prize to Justin Morrow, former player who comes from a small town in eastern Ontario. He arrived in Laval as a unilingual Anglophone. He learned French. He got his BA in Business Administration, and he set up a small company called Canadian Youth for French. This was a prize then for the creation of this organization and for the example that he set. I think that all these initiatives at the university level, sports initiatives and so forth that take place throughout Canada, they are a good sign for the future. And I think it's important to promote our two national languages in such events. I continue to be impressed by the commitment shown by Denis Briere, the rector of Laval University, and the support that the university has been giving to the learning of French. For years now, there have been programs for teachers who teach French. And there's also the Molson Scholarship for Anglophones who wish to study in French at Laval University. I think that this is probably the 5th consecutive year that I've taken part in the awarding of these scholarships. And I think it does show the degree of commitment shown by the university as well as the Molson Foundation that has been working very actively in supporting linguistic duality. Let me come back to a slightly more technical point raised in your report. You said that the roadmap does not have funding for coordinating funds provided by the Treasury Board Secretariat and the Canadian Department of Heritage. But the Canadian Heritage Department and official languages said that there was no changes to the fund, the way that operated. Why did you not make this correction in your report? If we look at the funding, there is no indication mentioned in the roadmap, and I think it is important for us to have this kind of information, this type of coordination, but perhaps Mr. Giguère can give you more detailed information on this particular point. And quite simply, as you were saying, Mr. Fraser, there was no clear indication that the money was included in the roadmap. We were later informed that money would be set aside for this in the departments, but we do not have access to all the figures in the department. We simply saw a roadmap that did not provide any funding for this particular purpose. The fact that it was not identified meant that it's more difficult for us to find out what is happening and how this money is being spent. When it disappears in the administration of a department, it is more difficult for us to follow the trace of the expenditures. Can you tell us whether you consider the department's reply to be adequate? We'd still like to have an idea of how this operates. It is one of the elements that we need. Because there have been changes in structure and certain functions have been integrated into this department, and it makes it more difficult for us to follow. Let me give you an example, language training. In the past, this was a responsibility of the Canadian Public Service School. The responsibility was later transferred to departments, and within departments it became a managerial responsibility. I made a point of not criticizing this decision, but the result is that it is far more difficult for us to see what the outcomes of this language training are when it is scattered among the departments. And likewise, it is more difficult for us to find out what type of coordination takes place when we do not have an identifiable figure in the documents that are provided in the roadmap. Thank you. Madame Saint-Denis. Good afternoon. My question will relate to your recommendations on the initiatives aimed at raising the level of bilingualism among Canadians. This afternoon, in the last half hour of the question period, out of the 6 questions that were put in French, the 3 ministers answered only in English. 1 minister started to answer in French, and this minister is francophone, but he decided to conclude his answer in English at a question that was put in French, and 2 Anglophone ministers answered in French. This is the situation. I'd like to know, do you think that the fact that French is not spoken much in the House of Commons, do you think that this is in contravention of the Official Languages Act? And does it have a negative effect on the promotion of linguistic duality in Canada? We did make a recommendation. We did make this particular recommendation in relation to statistics that were provided by Statistics Canada on the decrease of Canadians who are bilingual in English and French. And over 10 years, there was a drop of 24% of the number of Anglophone students who are studying French as a second language. With respect to the use of English and French in the House of Commons, any member of Parliament is entitled, and of course every minister is entitled, to make their choice to use either of the official languages. And there is no regulation stipulating that a minister should answer in the language in which the question was put. So this is why, of course, in 1958, the decision was made to introduce simultaneous interpretation. Yes, I can understand that. But I think that the Commissioner's office could make certain proposals, I imagine, because it certainly doesn't encourage bilingualism. Of course, there is no minister who would answer in French when the question is put to him in English. Can you do something about this? Can you make any recommendations or talk about certain incentives? I could discuss the matter, but I think that we have to realize that this is a right, an absolute right, such as the right of electors, for example, to choose, to vote for their member of parliament without any restriction relating to bilingualism or so forth. And it is also the requirement for the Prime Minister to choose ministers among members of Parliament. And it would be very difficult, in my opinion. And the other factor that I noted as a journalist is that the language is very often chosen because of the way in which they would like to have the answer shown on television. It is a political decision, and it doesn't relate in. I don't intend to criticize a politician on deciding to make a choice of a particular language in answering a question, and I think that a minister who does give an answer on a fairly sensitive matter or a political matter not only has the right, but sometimes I would say the responsibility to choose the language where he will be most comfortable. And so I would hesitate to get involved in any recommendation that might relate to the choice of one language or another in the House of Commons. Yes. I'd like to turn to another subject, something that is raised in your report I consider to be quite serious. What you talk about, what you refer to as active offer. There are all sorts of signs and so forth in airports and government organizations. There's no problem when it comes to these indications. But when we talk about the spontaneous offering of a service, I would say that there has been a very significant decrease. The Francophone Association of Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, they noted that this type of offer decreased by 12%. I'd like to know whether you intend to do something or to make some suggestions about what can be done. Would it be possible for you to intervene when it comes to making an active offer of service? I would say that this has been a theme that has recurred quite frequently in the reports of the commissioners, where we do observe that spontaneously offering a service does not seem to be part of the way in which the federal government institutions operate. We have made various recommendations on this point about an active office of service. There have been precedents. And we are starting to give some thought to this problem within the Commissioner's office. What is the best approach to this problem to bring about a change? Because so far, my recommendations, the recommendations made by predecessors, have been quite clear, but it is obvious that these recommendations have not had a significant impact. The only example, positive example that I can give you of an institution that has made an effort in order to provide an active offer of service as part of its general culture is Parks Canada. And this was before the Olympic Games, when they prepared a video for their employees explaining to them how to go about this and what to do if a unilingual employee found himself or herself in a situation of having to provide a service in the language that they do not speak. And they have a system which they explain in detail to their employees. And in our audit of Parks Canada, we were able to observe that the system works quite well. But what is required is a change in corporate culture. And if we take a look at what is done in the private sector, we can see that there are certain companies, there's, for example, a type of coffee shop that has created its own particular lingo, so to speak, for its products. So it is possible that this matter may evolve. Do I have time to make a suggestion, Mr. Chairman? No, for another round, perhaps. I think that you will have a chance then. Ms. Bateman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank all our witnesses for coming to the committee. I think it's very useful for us. I have two questions to put to the Commissioner and the Commissioner's office. But at the outset, I'd like to know what particular type of process is in place within the various departments for them to react to your recommendations. In order to ensure then that they are based on facts, that our observations are factual, would you say? To verify the facts, I'd like to know what type of audit actually takes place. This is the way we proceed when we receive a complaint. I send a letter to the Deputy Minister or to the president of an institution that is the subject of the complaint, and we note that a complaint was received making such and such an allegation, and that we intend to carry out an investigation under a particular section of the Act. The complainant makes an allegation about such an event, and we intend to conduct an investigation. If you have any questions, you will be able to contact the analyst who is carrying out the investigation. The analyst normally contacts someone from the department or the official languages coordinator or the person who is responsible for this issue. In an attempt to establish what the facts are. Is there any justification for the allegations? There are two elements that we deal with. First of all, we have to determine whether the complaint is admissible. Does it affect an institution that comes under the Act, under the legislation, and did this event occur? What point did this event occur? Someone may tell me, for example, that a letter was sent saying that such and such an institution dislikes francophones, and of course that cannot be the subject of a complaint. Whereas if it deals with a particular flight and service was not provided in French, then that is another matter.
If we say that something happened on a specific date, on a specific flight, language was not offered, that's acceptable. So we determine if the complaint is admissible, is valid or not, and then we begin a preliminary investigation with the institution. We say, we're doing a preliminary report. You have 30 days to answer concerning your vision of the facts. And if there's been an error, if we've misunderstood how things work for that department, we make the necessary corrections. And then we decide from that point on if the complaint is well-founded or not. Sometimes it takes as much work, and we look at it to determine whether or not a complaint is well-founded. And there are certain complainants who are unhappy with our decision, and then they ask for time to appeal our decisions. And then the complainant can also appeal to the federal court if they feel that we've made a mistake. Thank you. You've spoken many times about coordination initiatives throughout the federal government. And I'd be curious to know, does the Department of Canadian Heritage and Official Languages, has it answered your questions, particularly concerning these coordination initiatives throughout the Government of Canada, concerning responsibility when we did the audit on the federal provincial agreements? Yes, we had very good cooperation from the department. Sylvain, could you go into greater detail on this? Well, if I've understood correctly, you're talking about horizontal management from the Department of Canadian Heritage through the federal government. I believe that's what you're referring to. We've had very good discussions with Canadian Heritage. We know they're doing excellent work, excellent foundational work. If I've understood correctly, Mr. Giguère, did you say that each department is responsible and that there isn't coordination, a horizontal collaboration? Yes, there is horizontal management, but each department is also responsible for certain things. But what I mean is that several departments have great ideas. They have great initiatives that they'd like to implement. And Canadian Heritage's role, in many cases, is to make sure that all of these initiatives are brought together. And this isn't easy to do because they have a limited number of people, of course, who can work on this issue. And federal institutions tend to work in silos. So sometimes it's the fact that it's hard for people to see sometimes that there is, in fact, a horizontal management structure in place. Is this the most efficient way to work? Well, yes. If there's horizontal management, that's probably the most efficient way to work. If we were able to have a group that could work on all of the initiatives that federal institutions are undertaking, the 200 and some federal institutions, then I think that would be the ideal. Thank you very much. Your time is up, Ms. Bateman. No more time? Okay. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Could I share my time? I could give Ms. Bateman 1 more minute. Oh, he's so nice, my colleague. Thank you very much. I'd be curious to know, you've mentioned several times, well, you've referred to the fact that French is the language of ambition in Canada. Could you elaborate on that, please? Well, this is a sentence that I stole from a French ambassador who said that it was one of the things that had most impressed him about Canada. And that's an idea that I've repeated several times, saying that French is the language of ambition in Canada. And it's based on the following thoughts. In 1969, when the Official Languages Act was debated in the House of Commons, there were a number of MPs who argued that it would be the end of any job for anyone from Western Canada, that it would be impossible in the future for anyone from the West, who are, for the most part, unilingual, to get any good job within the federal government. Today, we have a Supreme Court, our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is from Alberta. We have had, until very recently, leader of the Defense Forces from Manitoba, the Chief of the Defense Staff, rather. All of these people were bilingual and are bilingual Anglophones. And I believe that it's because they wanted to understand the country in its entirety, and they wanted to move forward in their careers. They understood that knowledge of both official languages was a leadership requirement. And if you look at the top ranks of the federal service, the federal public service in Canada, it's full of people who have mastered both official languages, who've moved forward in their careers, knowing that this was a requirement for leadership and an essential tool to understand the country as a whole. Thank you. And obviously, I shouldn't need to mention this, but now it's an unwritten law that to become the leader of a political party in Canada, you need to be able to speak both official languages to be able to communicate with all Canadians and be able to understand them in both official languages. So I think that more and more this unwritten law, well, it's becoming understood by Canadians and Canadians in all walks of life. Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Mr. Williamson, do you have any questions? How much time do I have left, Chair? You have 4 minutes left.
Again, and I enjoyed reading your report and hearing from you today. What struck me, what I found most interesting was the current concerns, the cautions you raised about celebrating some of our historical anniversaries as a nation. And the next couple of years we have many. I mean, 1812 is ongoing, although I think that's one to celebrate because we as a nation, or before the nation was founded, but together, repulsed the American invasion, World War I, excuse me, Vimy, then perhaps for some even the birth of John A. Macdonald. Could you elaborate on that a little bit in terms of what your concerns are and how they might be addressed?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that these anniversaries, I don't mean to say by any means that I am critical of the idea of celebrating these anniversaries. I think that we are now living in a time when we welcome 250,000 newcomers to Canada every year. These are, by definition, people who have not grown up in Canada, who have not gone through our education system. In too many provinces, Canadian history becomes very localized, and so there is not a common history taught. I think that the decision by the government to celebrate anniversaries is a positive thing and represents huge opportunities for public education. And my concern is that that if these are done in too simplistic a way, they will lead to resentments rather than to celebrations. There are a whole variety of versions of what World War I and World War II represents for francophones and anglophones in Canada. One of the things that really impressed me about the War of 1812 commemoration was the exhibit at the Canadian War Museum, which quite explicitly presented 4 very different versions of the War of 1812. There was the British version, the American version, the Canadian version, and the Aboriginal version. And each group had a different interpretation and a different outcome. And so my cautionary note was that if these celebrations are not seen as occasions for a broader discussion of some of the shadows as well as the light in our historical experience of those events, they can simply result in resistance and disengagement rather than in celebration and engagement in a national project.
Quick follow-up.
Go ahead.
Just, is it fair? Let's look at what we've done already. Is it fair to say that the 1812 has been done with respect and it's been done well to date?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I was very impressed by the War of 1812. I think that, take for example the John A. Macdonald, what I would hope would be part of the John A. Macdonald discussion, John A. Macdonald was a very complex figure. I think that if you read the letter that he wrote to Brown Chamberlain in 1858, you see a huge understanding of linguistic and cultural duality in this country. I think that it stands as a kind of lesson for political leadership for the following century. I would hope that what John A. Macdonald had to say about French Canada, not only in that letter, but also at the end of the Confederation debates, would be part of any discussion of John A. Macdonald, that it's not just all about the railway, and it's not just about his drinking, but that we also have to remember as well that John A. Macdonald made the final decision that Louis Riel should be hung. I think that Louis Riel, as a historical figure, has been one that has really encouraged complexity of historical discussion, and it is really my hope that as we focus on these historical events, that we not do so in a simple flag-waving fashion, but in a way that encourages deeper understanding of the complexity of all of these events and of these historical figures.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nichols.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Commissioner, for bringing up Louis Riel and the complexity of this history and its meaning for our country. I'd also like to thank you on behalf of the Anglophone community in Quebec, the Anglo-Quebecois groups like the QCGN, CHSSN, the QWF. They've all told me that they're very delighted and satisfied with your work. Commissioner, I must tell you what you've already heard many times. Anglophones in Quebec have felt abandoned by successive Liberal and Conservative governments in terms of protection of their language, or at least at the very least, for not speaking up for them and their communities. In particular, I'm thinking here of seniors in Quebec, elderly Quebecers. And I know that you've mentioned and looked into this issue, the plight of Anglophone seniors in Quebec. Currently, as you may be aware, there's a transfer going on from the federal government to the province of Quebec for the St. Anne's Veteran Hospital. There's a part of that hospital that there's an intention to give geriatric services at that hospital. The catchment area that it touches would be my riding and Lac Saint Louis, which have quite a substantial Anglophone population. Can you share with the committee any recommendations for the guarantee of provision of Anglophone services at this institution? What has the federal government done to ensure that Anglophones are served in the official language of their choice at this hospital?
Well, when it was a veterans hospital, it was a federal institution, and we had relatively few complaints about the degree of which veterans were able to get services. One of the things that we have done recently is we did a study on the elderly Anglophones in Quebec. And one of the things that we observed is that there are, particularly off the island of Montreal, particular challenges for the elderly in getting health services in English. Not so much from doctors. Some 85% of doctors in Quebec are bilingual, but when the elderly are dealing with health services, they often, for many of their ailments and complaints, don't get to deal with the doctor. They're dealing with nurses, and nurses are much less likely to be bilingual. It is a challenge for the Quebec health system to have a sufficient degree of bilingual health support staff who can serve the Anglophone community. One of the things that was a factor in one of the successes of the roadmap has been the funding of various health networks, including the language training program that was developed at McGill for teaching English to staff of the health provision institutions in Quebec. And the last time I looked, I think there were 7,000, probably must be now about 10,000 healthcare workers who have taken this course. There are nevertheless limitations. When I was speaking to somebody in Granby about how effective this had been, she said, well, it means that if a 14-year-old falls off his bicycle and breaks his arm, it means that the nurse at the local clinic can put his arm in a cast and serve him in English. But if you've got a 55-year-old farmer who is suffering from early signs of Alzheimer's, that kind of service is much harder to find off the island of Montreal. And so that is what part of what we did in that study was simply identify all, the statistical services that are available and the various federal institutions that have some dealing with the elderly in Quebec. And it was a process which helped lead to the creation of a new organization called Seniors Action Quebec. In terms of transfer of responsibilities to specific institutions, I think the same rules apply. As there has to be a language clause in the transfer, and there has to be some kind of verification mechanism to make sure that those language clauses are being respected.
To this date, do you know if a language clause has been inserted in negotiations between the federal government and the province?
I can't tell you.
Okay.
I may give you a partial answer. We try to discuss with people, regional people with Vision Affaires in Montreal. They were not at the discussion table for this transfer, so we are trying to reach people in the headquarters in Charlottetown to have more information. But it's clear that we need to have this clause as a condition of transfer.
Okay, so the clause would be similar to what happened, say, at Willow Place in Alberta, but obviously not with French. So it would be that type of clause that you would recommend be inserted into the transfer?
Well, there would have to be a clause ensuring that the language services that were provided when it was a federal institution would continue to be provided. In the same way that when Air Canada stopped being a Crown corporation, there were clear clauses that ensure that Air Canada continues to fall under the Official Languages Act.
Okay, well, that's somewhat reassuring because some of my constituents now are going to Ontario for hospital services because we don't have a hospital in our region. And so with the creation of this hospital, I hope that it will respond to the need. You talked about the Seniors Action Quebec Network. Could you paint a picture for us what this group could do if it received federal funding as opposed to being a non-funded network?
Well, I think that it is very important as a source of information for Anglophone seniors who don't have the same kind of either statistical information, which we tried to provide in our study, or and which is available to francophones outside Quebec. I mean, I think one of the things that is often misunderstood about the elderly Anglophones in Quebec is that this is a generation that spent their working lives in Quebec when it was not essential for them to be bilingual, to be in the workplace. And it was also a period of their lives when they didn't really need social services and they had only marginal contact with the state. Now they are retired. Quebec society has changed. They need health services. They need the social services network. And sometimes with the best will in the world, those facilities are simply not available. And this is putting, in some cases, a real burden on a younger generation. I was visiting a community center in a remote part of Quebec where a young Anglophone woman had left home, had got a university education, and had come back home to run this community organization. And she kept being interrupted in her work because her mother needed an interpreter to deal with the social worker and the healthcare worker because they didn't have a common language. And it was when I saw her have to interrupt a meeting with me to take a call from her mother and talk to the social worker, I realized in very concrete terms what this means for for many people in the more remote parts of Quebec, and sometimes not so remote parts of Quebec. So I think that the creation and support for this new organization could be very important in ensuring that seniors get the information they need.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chisu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner, to appearing in front of our committee together with your staff. I would like to thank you very much for your extremely professional work which you are doing at the Commission. And je voudrais remercier aussi en français pour votre.
I'd also like to thank you in French for the work you're doing.
Regarding the roadmap of Canada official languages. So we all know that supporting Canadian arts and culture in Canada helps support the official language minority linguistic communities. Can you speak about how the previous roadmap, so the roadmap from 2008-2013, the funding of which are in this roadmap, helps these communities thrive? And also, would you say that the roadmap benefited Canadian linguistic communities?
Oh, unquestionably, I think that the roadmap has been a valuable contribution, and one of the areas where the roadmap was an improvement over the previous plan was that there was a cultural component. What I was subsequently told was that the reason there had not been a cultural component in the predecessor plan was that the artistic community had simply not been at a level to be able to manage the funding, and that but the roadmap, I guess, seeing how the initial plan worked, they responded by organizing and creating networks that could apply for and handle the funding that was being proposed. It is an extremely important program for support for linguistic duality for minority language communities, and as I said earlier, I think one of the most important aspects has been the health networks that were created, which is a kind of model for other networks that are being developed, and I think the cultural component that was added in 2008 was has been significant and has played an important role.
Do you have any examples that you can share with us about this?
Well, again, I get the example that I am most familiar with is the creation of the health networks, both for Francophone health services across Canada and also Anglophone health services in Quebec, which it was the funding that I referred to earlier that led to language training of staff. There has been the introduction of various networks linking Francophone health services across the country so that much better communication takes place. We've seen due to some roadmap funding and these health networks, Montfort Hospital playing an important, developing important support relationships with other healthcare institutions across the country. It's been a while since I've looked at the cultural component, so I don't have examples on the tip of my tongue. But I can get back to you later if you like, in terms of when I will refresh my memory and get back to you.
Thank you very much. Because we are still at the issue, at the subject of the roadmap, in your annual report, you are discussing the new roadmap.
Yes.
So what are the strengths and the weaknesses of this new initiative? And at this point, are you satisfied with the implementation of the new roadmaps program? So we are now in the...
There's one element of the new roadmap where I have questions, and that is the element of adding 120 million for language training for immigrants. I think that it's, I'm certainly not opposed to language training for immigrants, but at this point, we don't have the information to see whether this is language training for immigrants that is going to support immigrant communities in minority language communities in Canada. It's a complex issue. We've seen the expiry of the 5-year immigration program that was designed to support immigration to French-speaking minority communities across Canada. We're not yet sure what the implications of that expiry is and what relationship, if any, there is to that 120 million. There were some things that were, I think that some of the strengths in the previous roadmaps have been sustained. One of the things that I regret is there have been some cuts for language training that I think is unfortunate.
Okay, thank you. Monsieur Dion Labelle.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Commissaire, Mesdames.
Good afternoon, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. I intend to continue questioning on the roadmap. We've met a few times. The committee devoted several meetings talking about to the subject of the roadmap and groups that benefit from this. Most of them were satisfied with the type of progress that was achieved because of the roadmap. But throughout this discussion, we did hear the same comments about the opacity of this roadmap. People didn't realize whether the money was coming from the roadmap or from other programs and or other agreements at the national level. And can you tell me, there is a recommendation number 2 here that refers to improving the management framework. And as part of the discussion, the question of management was not included. The responsibility of management when it comes to this roadmap program. Can you tell me whether you think that we're going to repeat the mistakes that were made in the first version of the roadmap, or we will have a better idea of how money is to be distributed? I have to admit that I face a problem somewhat similar to the one that you described in finding out what money of the funds identified in the roadmap is new money, what comes from existing programs that have been consolidated as part of the roadmap. It's often very difficult for us to discover how this money has been spent. But once again, I'll ask Sylvain to give you a more detailed answer, since he had more contacts with the various departments. We did have conversations with various departments, and there is money that comes from the appropriations or the money that was voted. We don't know how much new money will be available. Another interesting point is that in the last roadmap, there is money that was set aside for projects that were meant to expire. They've expired. So it's quite understandable that some of this funding has not been renewed. But to carry out an overall assessment is difficult because we cannot find out from the departments, citizenship and immigration, for example, how much money was voted for the roadmap. And you can imagine the difficulty that we have as parliamentarians. You are responsible for monitoring this roadmap very closely. But when we as parliamentarians have to deal with this, we talked about the need for a more transparent management framework where parliamentarians would be able to see how money flows and is spent within the departments. But we've not yet reached this stage. I'm surprised to see that this government that claims to be such a good financial manager, but when we look at very concrete details, this does not prove to be the case. The $3 billion, for example, in the security money that has been traced, $124,000, for example, in the roadmap. We don't know how it is being spent, and I think it would be useful for us to have a monitor. When I talked about the 3 cases of administrative muddle, the administrators said that this was indeed the case. Can you tell us whether there's an independent assessment of the roadmap, and are there any specific recommendations relating to this? I have to say that I didn't give much thought to this. I can't give you a well-thought-out answer. But to continue what I was saying previously, there are certain elements that have disappeared from the new roadmap, and I think that this is unfortunate. For example, certain pilot projects that were set up by the Canadian Public Service School, which meant that 11 universities were able to provide language training for people who were interested in becoming public servants. People would be able to receive training in keeping with the standards set by the Public Service Commission, and they would be able to enter the public service with the required level. There hasn't been any continuation of this, no funding, and it strikes me as a regrettable decision. There are other elements that have been successful and that are continuing. As Mr. Giguère did mention, it is often difficult for us to find out which money has already been spent or which money was already part of the budget of the department. Yes, I think that this is the problem. In the 120 million, was this money previously allocated? Is it new money? This is a question that we are trying to clarify. And I think it's one of the points that I made in my opening statement. We'll attempt to find out what is being done in the case of immigration in particular. We have certain questions that we would like to obtain answers for so that we have a better idea of what's taking place.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner and staff for being here. And I'm relatively new to this portfolio, so this committee, so I may ask you some really innocent-looking questions, but
those are always the hardest.
So one of the things that I understand your role to be is to sustain equality in both French and English in Canada. Is that? There's very little in the mandate that speaks to the quality of French or the quality of English. What the mandate speaks to is the equality of status. But I am not a. I think probably some of my staff people would disagree with this, but I'm not a grammarian, and although I have certain obsessions with split infinitives, would any time that we get a complaint about somebody who does not speak the other language well enough, I'm always a little hesitant to embark on that discussion. So my question is kind of derived from that. What is being done in the Francophone communities across the country, okay, to support their ability to speak English at a reasonable level, so that things like what my colleague has said over there, with regards healthcare services for some of the folks, can actually be conducted in that province?
Well, Quebec is the only province where the learning of the minority language is obligatory to the end of high school. And so in terms of the minority Francophone communities, one of the things that there's a phrase that is often repeated in minority language communities, on n'apprend pas l'anglais, on l'attrape. We don't learn English, we catch it, like a cold. I mean, that it's, and that if you look at the statistics, the level of bilingualism in minority language communities, certainly outside Quebec, is very high. In Quebec, 60% of Anglophones are bilingual. 80% of Anglophones between 18 and 34 are bilingual. So the challenge that minority communities have had over the years has not been so much ensuring that the members of that community learn or speak English well. It is ensuring that French can thrive in their institutions. I've noticed a significant change over the last few decades with the introduction of French language minority schools across the country, and French language school boards, and French language legal associations. So there is now, and the health networks that have been developed through the roadmaps, there's still a continuing challenge, and there are many people in the minority Francophone organizations who will say that one of the key learning points should be that there should be much more focus on early childhood education in French, to ensure that when a child goes to childcare, that's the language that they are learning in, because they've found with a pilot project in Windsor that children who went to childcare programs in French then went on to primary school and secondary school in French. So it becomes a very important element for the vitality of minority communities.
Thank you. One of the other questions that comes to mind for me is that when we looked at the post-secondary education at the last committee meeting, lots of courses in universities covering the arts, covering all sorts of management studies, etc. But for engineering, I believe there's only 2 universities that provided technical services, technical courses in electronics, in mechanical engineering, aeronautical engineering, all those sorts of things. Can you help me understand why engineering is not well supported in the universities? Because literally, having spoken earlier today about the expansion in the aeronautical space in Montreal, they have a requirement for huge numbers of engineers and designers, etc. That may not be fulfilled with this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel. Mr. Fraser, go ahead.
I think that part of the challenge has been that until the 1960s, really, engineering education in Quebec happened substantially in English, even in the French language universities. That it was very difficult to find textbooks, professors, and that engineering is a sufficiently technical field in areas where multinational companies have adopted English as primarily their language of operation, that it has been a challenge. One of the turning points for engineering education in Quebec was the creation of, or the expansion of Hydro-Quebec acquiring the private electricity companies in Quebec in the early 1960s, which gave a huge thrust to French language engineering in Quebec, and Hydro-Quebec continues to be Hydro-Quebec, Bombardier, CGI. There was a report done for the Quebec government back in the early 80s called Le Virage Technologique, the technological turning point, which resulted in significant Quebec investment in biotechnology, computer technology, and imaging technology, and so we've seen those, and we've seen the growth of those areas.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Fraser. Mr. Benskin from Montreal.
Thank you. Yes, and the home of ETS, École Technique Supérieure, which is c'était un les premières.
The ETS was one of the first schools. One of the first engineering schools in Quebec. And it's also in my writing.
To a question, the question from my honourable friend across the way in regards to learning a second language in order to get services, and for me, I think that's a dangerous road to travel down, because therein lies the danger of a culture losing itself. The discussion of language, la discussion sur la langue, c'est pas seulement discussion sur
A discussion of language is more than just the language. When we discuss a language, we discuss a culture, and Canada is founded on two cultures, Francophone and Anglophone cultures.
Pull out something out of your report in regards to the roadmap and one of the concerns you raised. And I'll cite this in English. Very few funds are allocated specifically to research and to the collection of reliable data in support of policy development and decision-making in the area of official languages. Little effort was made to guarantee funding for research and language statistics on an ongoing basis, in particular, within Statistics Canada. Such funding is crucial, however, in order to obtain a picture of the linguistic trends in the country. I think that's a very profound statement. I think it's a very telling statement in terms of the choices that we make. The choices the government makes, what we as parliamentarians make in terms of what we offer to the communities, the linguistic minority communities, the Anglophone community in Quebec, the Francophone community outside of Quebec. And if we don't have that information, if we don't put the resources into getting that information, how are we going to be able to get a proper picture of the status, including the dangers faced by the Francophone community outside of Quebec and the Anglophone community inside Quebec?
I think that you've put your finger on one of the challenges that Statistics Canada has encountered with the end of the obligatory long-form census and its transformation into a voluntary census document, which has created a situation in which there are some communities in which the response rate was too low for there to be valid data. We had a number of complaints about the abolition of the long-form census. We did an investigation, and it became clear that no federal institution had recommended the end of the long-form census. And so it was a decision that was, the nature of the decision was, if you like, protected by cabinet secrecy, and we unfortunately cannot cross that boundary that has been created by the nature of the secrecy of the cabinet system. But even though we were not able to find that any federal institution had not met their responsibilities under the Official Languages Act in terms of the decision on the long-form census, I think that it was regrettable, and it has meant that it is that much more difficult to have the kind of detailed information that social agencies, that government agencies, that community groups, that various organizations involved in social welfare of various kinds need to be able to know where those services are most necessary.
So under the present structure, how do we, how could the roadmap, the current roadmap, or any other resource help communities, linguistic minorities, understand what's happening in their communities better, so that they, not as a language but as a culture, can continue to contribute to their survival?
Well, I think that one of the, our interpretation of the obligation under Part 7 of the Act, which was amended in 2005 to ensure that all federal institutions have a binding obligation to take positive measures for the growth and development of minority language communities, that obligation to be appropriately met requires consultation with minority language communities, and that process of consultation, I'm not saying that it can replace the statistical tools that have been lost, but it is nevertheless all the more important in the absence of those statistical tools.
Okay, thank you very. If you have a brief question, go ahead.
No, it's not brief.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Betzkin. Monsieur Gourde.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier you mentioned that at the international level, engineering companies have had good opportunities in Europe. Is that because we have 2 official languages in Canada? Does that allow better market penetration in Europe for our companies? Or is it because Canada's engineering is superior to that of other countries? Well, I'm certainly not an expert in international trade. However, I know that we've just signed, well, more than a draft of, but the final, I know there's still some negotiations left, and we haven't ratified it yet, but we have signed on to a free trade agreement with the European Union. I think that that's going to open the door for Canadian businesses to have more access to Europe. From my point of view, young Canadians who are studying at Canadian universities have more and more international opportunities available to them. And I've always felt that when young people learn both official languages, it opens doors for them at the international level. And I've seen that more and more young Canadians are active at the international level, and for many of them, that involvement at the international level started with their learning the other official languages, That's opened them up to other cultures and helped dispel myths about the other language. I know that there are international companies that are looking for Canadians because of their cultural knowledge and because of their linguistic abilities. So the future is promising for young Canadians who spoke both official languages. And if you could add Spanish, that would open up the North American market to European countries, European companies. So all that together for a young Canadian to choose Spanish, Italian, German as a third language, that would have advantages at the international level. I certainly agree with that. I think it's undeniable that it's easier to learn a third language than to learn a second language. Learning a language is a physical activity as much as anything else, and we become better at learning other languages when we learn a second language. I've always been struck by the number of young Canadians who started by being bilingual Canadians, if you will, who've mastered our two official languages, who've then moved on to learn a third language, and that's allowed them to work in other countries, among other things. In Canada, we always, we refer to our official languages. Other countries refer to national languages. Would it be stronger to say national languages than official languages? Well, that's an interesting question, and that was the subject of, the beginnings of a discussion in our office. We've seen the use of this term, national languages. We saw it, for example, in the speech from the throne. I don't have a clear response for you on the distinction and whether or not we should make the difference between an official language on one hand and a national language on the other. I think that there's a risk of creating a hierarchy of languages if we say that, well, look, these languages are official and these others are national in that they're limited to a certain area. But I've only just started thinking about this question, so I wouldn't want to give you more of an answer right now. Thank you. Mr. Godin. Commissioner, I hope that you'll think quickly and you'll say no. Because, people don't respect official languages all the time. If we talk about national languages, it's going to get even worse. It's going to be problematic for people in regions. And, of course, your mandate as Commissioner is not to make sure that people in language minority communities learn the other language. Your mandate is to make sure that all Canadians have access to services in both official languages. And if in the future we put more effort into making minority language communities learn the other language, that means we'll be offering fewer services in the language of their choice. We talked to... So I just want to make sure that the Blues reflect what happened at Tabush Tech we mentioned earlier. And one thing's clear in the roadmap, there's $120 million for immigration, and that money comes from the Department of Immigration. That's money that's already been spent and that's been transferred here. So when the government says, no, we didn't take any money out of the roadmap, there's still $1.2 billion, that's not true. There's already $120 million that we know very clearly are coming already from the immigration envelope. Earlier, you said that you were evaluating your options to make sure that the Treasury Board respects language its obligations concerning the nominations by decree and or governed in council. And we noted that in the library, library and archives, bilingualism was not required. Was there an objective evaluation done as to whether or not this would be necessary? Well, we received a complaint on this issue, and it's currently being investigated. And so, unfortunately, I can't speak further to it at this time. But there are certain positions where I believe it's obvious that bilingualism is essential. That's a fact that's been recognized in the bill, which was adopted unanimously by Parliament for officers of Parliament. I think that the same idea can be applied to other positions, but when it comes to this particular issue, it's being investigated by our office, and I can't give you a detailed answer at this time. Access to justice. Have the Department of Justice and the Minister of Justice responded to your recommendations concerning the need to collaborate with their colleagues in the provinces and territories to make sure that there are sufficient linguistic abilities in both languages in courts across the country? We know that there's a problem here because people are appointed to these jobs, and the Francophone community outside of Quebec, for example, doesn't have access to justice in the language of their choice. In Alberta, BC, or Nova Scotia, there's a lack of linguistic ability. What are your comments on this? Well, as you know, we did this study on the bilingual abilities of the superior courts. I presented this study at a meeting of the Canadian Bar Association in Saskatoon in August. The minister was there. Somebody asked him a question about it. He received it with interest. And I had a phone conversation with him because the minister had recently changed portfolios, and I had warned his predecessor that the study was coming, and I didn't want Minister MacKay to be taken by surprise in Saskatoon. So I did have a brief conversation with him in July. The report was presented in August, and in the context of the annual report, I had a meeting with him where I explained in detail what the recommendations were. We had a very good conversation. He received the recommendations with a great deal of interest. And we also met with the Deputy Minister when we were preparing the report. And the report was well received with a positive attitude. But we'll see in the future what the results of these conversations will be. However, all I can say now is that the study and our explanations concerning the study were received with interest, were well received. And so I have no reason to believe that the report won't be followed up on, but we'll see what happens in the future. I have another question. You've been here for 7 years. You're now appointed for another 3 years. You'll be in your position until 2015. You make reports or present reports. You wait for a response from the government. Often you've made reports that indicate that the Act has not been respected or that the Act has not been applied. What will you do in the next 3 years? Look, I'm trying to be respectful. Will you just let things continue, or will you use the courts to make sure that the government respects the Official Languages Act? Thank you, Mr. Godin. Mr. Fraser. Well, I will use all the tools that I have in my toolkit to make sure that the recommendations we make be implemented and that the Act be respected. Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Williamson.
Chair, and through you, I'm going to kind of come back to this question about the, I guess, the funding allocation or the lack thereof. And can you let me know, because I used to do this when I was with the Taxpayers Federation, try to track down how governments were spending money, and I know it can be exceptionally frustrating, particularly when sometimes government changes how they report a line item in a budget. You assume the worst, but sometimes you realize that it's just it could in fact be done for innocent reasons. Not always, mind you, but sometimes. So I'm curious to know what process your office uses to ensure that the information you're reporting on or you're reviewing is adequately researched and is in fact accurate.
we try to be as rigorous as possible. The person who is responsible for our research capacity is somebody with a PhD. The person who is responsible for our audits also has a PhD. We have highly educated researchers who do rigorous work. They try to ensure that there is a sufficient consultation with the institutions. I was explaining to your colleague how through the complaint investigation process there is a preliminary draft that goes to the institution and to the complainant, and we receive their comments. The same thing happens with the audit process. That if we do an audit of an institution, they get a preliminary draft. They will have their comments, sometimes quite lengthy comments. Sometimes we take those into account, and sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree. There have been cases where we acknowledge that there was a misunderstanding of the operation of a particular function, and we take into account the correction that's explained and make the change. But our analysts, our researchers produce high quality work, and we try to ensure that our work is as rigorous as possible.
Yeah. And are you satisfied with the give and take from the department, and are you satisfied with the answers you received to date?
It depends on the department. By and large, I would say that we have a positive relationship with departments. As I said in my declaration, one of the things that has struck me over the years that I've been commissioner is that public servants want to do the right thing. What I didn't say. Deputy ministers, in my experience, are highly successful people who have got to where they've been by being quite successful and competitive, and they don't like it if their department is found to failing in its responsibilities. One of the things that I have noticed is that when the head of a department or the head of an agency takes this issue seriously, changes happen and improvements are made. If the head of the agency doesn't take it seriously, that message gets sent immediately through the department, and it's a kind of these complaints just become viewed as part of the price of doing business, and we're not going to take it very seriously. Others say, this is unacceptable, we're going to have an action plan, we're going to ensure that we perform better.
Thank you. I have no other further questions, but I'll thank you for you and your team appearing today for my questions. Over to the Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson. Madame Saint-Denis.
Once again, in relation to the roadmap, my colleague said we don't understand much of how the money is being spent. I'd like to know whether you do have a certain leeway in your use of money in carrying out particular programs. For example, programs involving French language communities outside Quebec that may be experiencing more difficulties than others. Do you have a certain amount of leeway in offering a program? Or with respect to culture, for example, would it not be a good idea to have a program that demonstrates the importance of the two cultures? I know that you did publish a pamphlet on this. The advantages is, for example, that a country that is bicultural. Mr. Chairman, I think that we have to make a distinction here between the administration of a program and promoting a particular activity. And I have the freedom to engage in the promotion of linguistic duality, but I'm not responsible for administering programs. If there is an organization in a minority community that informs us they need money, it is not part of my mandate to write them a check. On the other hand, I did refer to a study that was done on English-speaking seniors in Quebec. We did hold a series of consultations with English language groups. We proposed a consultation on a number of subjects. And one of our ideas, they told us, was not of interest to them. What they would be more interested in was a study on what programs, what federal programs, would have an impact on Quebec seniors. So we did take their advice, and in fact, we decided to do a study where we compiled or gathered statistical data on seniors in Quebec. This data had never been gathered before, brought together. And we published a list of federal programs that do have an impact on English-speaking seniors in Quebec. We also carried out a series of studies of the vitality of the minority communities in different parts of Canada. And we worked very closely with these communities in identifying their strengths and weaknesses of the particular communities. This was a collaborative process that enabled us to identify the needs of the community. So I think that there's a distinction between carrying out audits and studies that might be useful for a given minority community and administering a particular program for a minority community. But once a study has been done and you reach a number of conclusions, are you in a position to make suggestions to the government about setting up a program that would respond to a particular need? Yes, certainly. And this is something that we've often done. I have still have time for a question. With respect to airport authorities, I think that it's quite obvious that the level of bilingualism is extremely weak. And when the Commissioner's office shows up at one of these airport authorities, can you tell me what type of collaboration you receive and how you are perceived in your attempt to show interest in what they're doing? That's a good question. First of all, I should note that we did have very polite exchanges, meetings. With those who are responsible. There are certain airport authorities that now have certain requirements to meet that they didn't have to previously. If they have, for example, over 1 million passengers a year, then the requirements are higher than what they were previously. And they suddenly discover that they are expected to meet certain obligations that when they didn't have to take into account before. So I normally have a polite reception, and they tell me that they will look into it. We in the Commissioner's office have prepared information for passengers, and we hope to have a pilot project at the Winnipeg Airport. It was accepted, but at the last minute, this acceptance was withdrawn, and we were not allowed to inform passengers that they had certain language rights. The Airport Association was the one responsible deciding that they would not have us inform passengers about their language rights, because this would lead people to assume that these rights would be respected. So we were thinking about how we will convey to the traveling public that they do have certain rights and these rights can be expected. Lastly, Mr. Nichols. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question to ask you about the issue of leadership. Commissioner, on page 65, you said the different indicators indicate that with respect to the promotion of linguistic duality, the government is lagging behind the population rather than leading it. And I'd like you to indicate what these indications are, and can you give me examples of where the government is promoting linguistic duality?
Here today that suggests that minority communities should learn the majority language. I think that shows a bit of the problem, but could you elaborate on that point?
I feel very strongly that leadership is the critical element in ensuring that both languages, our linguistic duality, be seen as a value and not as a burden. I think that we are in a situation now in which the leaders of all political parties use both languages, do so effectively, do so across the country. I recently was interviewed by a journalist based in Washington for La Vanguardia, which is a Catalan newspaper in Barcelona, and he had come to Canada during the last election campaign and had heard the Prime Minister in Vancouver and the then leader of the opposition in Toronto, and he said they both spoke French during their speeches, even though it was clearly an English-speaking audience. Why would that be? And I explained to him that political leaders in this country take linguistic duality seriously, and also they want to get on television in the other language, and so that that this is part of. En termes des indices de l'acceptation de la public.
With respect to the indications relating to public acceptance, I think I can say that I'm old enough that I can remember the time when the national anthem was booed when it was sung in English and French. And I think we've gone beyond that time. And I can remember that there was just as much reaction to and laughing to jokes in French as in English, when it might be assumed that the audience was mainly English-speaking. But I could tell from the audience's reaction that Canada had changed and that Canadians had become more passively bilingual than they were in the past. And that instead of having the impression that French was a foreign language, I would say that it is increasingly considered to be a language of which Canadians are proud. This is not always the case. There may be unfortunate incidents. There are always certain types of incidents that occur with respect to the minority language in all sorts of regions in Canada. It's not something that I approve of. But I think that people have reached the stage where they are probably more progressive than certain people who are afraid of using the other official language in the fear that they might offend someone in the audience. This is simply an opinion. It's not based on anything statistical, but it's an impression that I've had.
And it touches on the roadmap once again. I've been talking to support organizations in Montreal that help young Anglophones integrate into the economy, and their funding ran out in spring, as you know. And I noticed on page 55 the elimination of funding for the roadmap programs for coordinators of federal institutions, policies, and programs relating to the Act. And someone actually working in one of the organizations said, what's going to happen? So it shows that this coordination's not going on. They don't know how to continue providing these quality services without proper funding. How can we remedy this problem?
Well, I think there are two problems. One is and one of them, I think there has been some improvement, in part because of some of the crises that occurred for some organizations in the past, where the funding that went to community organizations would take so long to arrive that they would find themselves getting the check in October and would all have to be spent by March 31st. Sometimes those delays in funding meant that people had to be laid off. People who might otherwise have been hired for the summer were not hired. It meant that when there was work that they were intending to do, rather than being able to hire somebody locally, because nobody was able to, the local firm would be too small to be able to turn on a dime and produce the work starting in October. They would have to go to a much larger firm in a big city that would have the resources so they could respond quickly, which meant that they were, rather than this strengthening the community, it simply further centralized work away from the community. Canadian Heritage introduced some changes in which, for a number of funding programs, there would be part of the money would go out earlier rather than the entire check going out at the end of the whole process. But I think that with project funding of any kind, it is always problematic because there is project funding, there is ongoing funding, and I've had a number of conversations with people who've said, we've got project funding until the end of the year, but we're not sure if we're going to be able to keep the organization going when this particular project funding expires. So it is a serious challenge for a lot of very important community organizations.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to all members of the committee for their questions and comments. I want to thank the Commissioner for his annual report. I thought it was quite thorough and detailed, so congratulations on producing that report. C'est toujours un plaisir.
It's always a pleasure for us to have you here.
This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.